Hello, everyone. This is the August event of Indic Forum. Indic Forum every month, especially on the second Saturday of every month, organizes talk by an author who has written books around India, Indian history, culture, religion, and so on. And we do this to promote the authors, their books, their ideas. It also serves as an event to help people network. So this month we have a very popular author, Dr. Subhash Kak. Now he doesn't need any introduction. He's a well-known computer scientist, has written over 20 books. Uh, he has done research in neural network consciousness, quantum computing, and so on. And today he's going to talk about his book, Idea of India. The idea of India is a condensation of new research that provides an authentic picture of what India meant to its own people and those living in West Asia, Europe, East Asia, and so on. The evidence provided in this book is also touches upon the India's contribution to the world science and its influence on its neighbors. It has also translations of a few Rigvedic hymns as well as an essay on yoga. So this book has been reviewed by many people, has gotten very rave reviews, and it's a very important book. The link to buy the book will be posted in the chat. So if you want to buy the book, you can buy the book. It's also in our Eventbrite event description. Uh, Having said that, I'll give the floor to Dr. Kak so he can talk about his book.
Thank you, Akshay. Delighted to be a part of your series. How I came to write this book is because for many years, more than 30 years, I've been working on history of science. And in particular, I've also researched history of Indian sciences. And there's a huge disconnect between what scholars know about Indian science and its history and what the layperson knows about it. In fact, the layperson's idea of not only Indian science, but Indian civilization is through the lens of the colonial historians, which has been repeated in school textbooks and college books in India. And this does not, this particular view does not conform to reality. If you go to the original text, you find that what you have there is so totally different from what you're being told. And what you're being told was dictated by considerations of the empire that you had to justify why you are in India, and you are in India so that Indians will learn science and so on and so forth. So this was the segue, and through my studies over many, many years of Indian science and its history, then I also looked into the original texts, and you discover that the general idea that we are being given about Indian society is truly not correct. And in fact, it's very funny that you have a contest between different narratives taking place in the US also at this time, especially say related to caste in California. And that is in itself is based on ideas which were created truly only in the last 200-300 years. And in fact, the idea of caste, as understood by a lot of people, was created by British anthropologists after the 1901 census, where they insisted that jatis, which are lineages that people have, must be force-fitted into different varnas, in the four varna scheme. The varnas are different from the jatis, but they insisted that this had to be done, and then the British classified certain jatis as being of one type or the other. In fact, certain jatis were called criminal, and so on. And sadly, these ideas, because there were benefits to be gained through this scheme, which was pushed by these guys, and they've been internalized in India itself. and are being exported through academics who live in their own bubbles. And a lot of the academics do not know the original text. So this is a complicated story. It touches upon many different fields, not just the sciences, but also society. And so it was my effort to bring it all together, which I did initially through general articles, popular articles. Then I brought it all together in this particular book.
And in a summary, like what is your idea of India? Because a lot of people have used this phrase, the idea of India, including Indian courts, where they have meant it in a very different way. So in few sentences?
Yeah, what's my idea of India? The idea of India, India's self-definition, if you will, going back to the earliest layer of literature, which is the Vedas. And the word Veda itself means knowledge. And what the Vedas say is that they are all about Atma Vidya, which is self-knowledge, or the knowledge of consciousness, which is the capacity which makes us understand the universe. So basically, Indian society, or the Indian area, geographical or cultural area, has been dedicated to pursuit of knowledge. It's a civilization of knowledge, and knowledge not only related to the inner self, because that many Western scholars have conceded, but also the outer reality, because how the Vedas see reality is as having two aspects to it. One is the outer, the other is the inner, and you need both in order to make sense. And what's interesting is that this idea, self-knowledge idea, was sort of acknowledged by outsiders. For example, the famous book on various nations, which was written by Said al-Andalusi, a Moorish, that is a Muslim scholar from Spain, in 1065, I think it was, where he compares different nations of the world. And in his essay, he says that, in his book, he says that India is the foremost scientific nation, number one. And then he also looks at other nations such as, Persia and Arabia and Rome, Rome meaning Italy, and so on. And so this is a long time ago, more than 1,000 years ago, in the far corners of Europe. People acknowledged that India was the foremost nation. And then you look at Eastern Asia, you look at China and Japan, as you know, for about 1,000 years, or more than 1,000 years, Indian or Sanskrit texts were translated into Chinese. And there was a whole stream of scholars from India who went through Central Asia to China. And a lot of these texts were translated. And they have had a huge impact on Asian cultures as well. And likewise, in my book, I also present new evidence which points to how these ideas also went westwards, the Himalayas, to Samarkand and Bukhara and beyond, to the Iranian lands and beyond, to the Slavic world. And there was also a very vigorous trade between India and Rome. And in fact, evidence of this trade is to be found in different places in South India. Roman coins, for example. And in fact, there is a very well-known statement about 200 BCE in Rome, where this gentleman is ruing the fact that a large fraction of Roman wealth is being drained to India because of the Roman addiction, if you will, to Indian spices. So there was a lot of trade, and this was a trade not just of material things, but must have also been accompanied by people going in both directions. So there was interaction. So the influence of India to the outside world did not take place only across the Himalayas, which is what I focus on, because the influence through the seas to Southeast Asia is very well known. Indonesia was, greater until the time of the Dutch. It was called Greater India and Bali, and we all know all of that very well. But also the trade towards the West and Arabia and Egypt, that is much better known, which is what I've left out in my book.
Yeah, thanks for that answer. Another question I had is that, there are many authors who have come on our show, have constantly talked about how India was a great power these many years ago, that we are ahead in almost every form of science. The world looked at us, we influenced rest of the world. But clearly, if you look at India's situation today, that's not where we are today. So clearly there is some decline or stagnation. So according to you, what were the causes and how we can potentially reverse it?
Well, if you look at comparative economists, they would all agree, and you can Google it and get the information very quickly, that India's share of the world economy was about 45% around 1000, for 1,000 years or longer. India was 45% or higher share of the world economy. And then it sort of declined somewhat, because India went through a warring period and invasions and so on. But in spite of that, around 1800, it's estimated that India's share of the world economy was about 20%, 20 or slightly higher. And by the time the English left, because in the 19th century, what happened was the Industrial Revolution, and the British, through their policies after their control of India, ensured that India did not build those factories which the British were building in their own country. And India became a dumping ground for British products. And so it's been estimated that in 1914, 1918 or thereabouts, India's share of the world economy, from about 20 or 25% when the British arrived or British took control, 1800, had declined to as little as 1.8%. After the Second World War, some industrialists were allowed to build factories. And so by the time the British left, it was up to maybe 2 or 3%. Now, if you look at purchasing power parity, PPP terms, I think India's share has climbed back to about 9%. And as we know, India is already the world's third largest economy by PPP computation. And if you look at nominal dollar terms, it's the fifth largest, and even in nominal dollar terms, it's expected to become the third largest in the next 5-7 years. So India is not doing that badly anymore, and India's arc is upwards. And in fact, it's estimated, even Goldman Sachs, I think they had a story yesterday, the day before, that India will become the second largest economy in the next 30 or 40 years. And in fact, there are some estimates that it'll be the second largest much sooner, in PPP terms, maybe in 10, 15 years. So things are changing. And one reason, of course, is that India was always the most populated region in the world. So even though on a per capita basis, India will remain behind the United States and Europe for much more time, but as a country, India is expected to be the driving engine. Now, what other influence has India had in spite of its economic decline in the last 2 or 3, 4 centuries? First of all, let's not forget that what is correlated with India's general decline after 1000 or 1200 was the destruction of all its universities. When the invasions came, all its universities were destroyed. India still did a lot of cutting edge scientific research or astronomy or mathematics continued till the destruction of Vijayanagar Empire in 1560s. Because if you look at the great Kerala school of mathematics and astronomy, all its great figures lived on until the 16th century and so on. And after that, it was confined, but it was done in families after the destruction of the universities. But in spite of that, if you look at modern science and you look at, say, quantum mechanics, the creator of quantum mechanics, Erwin Schrödinger, in his autobiography claims that the central idea, quantum mechanics has two central ideas. One is that of superposition. In the micro world, you have superposition of mutually exclusive states. And the second idea is that when you interact with a state, you get access to one of these. So both these ideas were already present in Indian thought, or Indian physics, if you will. And Schrödinger, to come back to that story, in his autobiography claims that this one central idea of superposition came to him from the Upanishadic Mahavakya, I am Atma Brahma, which means that this Atman is equivalent to the entire cosmos, which gave him this idea that in the microstate, all mutually exclusive possibilities should coexist. This idea, the other idea, that you obtain one out of many is from the Vaisheshika Sutras, that you have the physical universe, which is totally determined by dravya, guna, and karma, which means substances, their properties, and their motions. But as far as we individuals are concerned, there is another triad at work, which is the universal, which is samanya, the particular to the observer, which is vishesha, and third is samavaya, which is the interaction of the cognitive apparatus of the individual and the physical world, which is where the reality gets reduced to one of the possibilities, which is, the other central idea of quantum mechanics. So this, I'm not suggesting that all this was present in Indian thought, but clearly the creators of quantum mechanics were inspired, and not just Schrödinger, but the other creator of quantum mechanics is Heisenberg. He also has written on it, saying how the counterintuitive ideas of quantum mechanics make sense only when you look at them through the lens of Indian thought. Not just this. Now look at scientific revolution itself. The scientific revolution is traced back to the invention of infinite series by Leibniz and Newton. Or invention of infinite series was a precursor to calculus. So you needed calculus for modern sciences to develop. But now historians acknowledge that infinite series were developed by mathematicians of the Kerala School of Mathematics at least 200 years prior to their invention or rediscovery in Europe. And calculus can also be seen in Kerala School of Mathematics, or perhaps even earlier when you go to Bhaskaracharya and so on. So now there are some historians who are suggesting that the Jesuits who were present in India at that time took some of these ideas to Europe, although we don't have any hard evidence, but clearly these things did take place in India prior to Europe. And then there are some other very intriguing parallels. One is, or points of inspiration. As we know, Mendeleev, after whom the periodic table of elements is named, he was trying to put the elements in a two-dimensional table, just like the Sanskrit Aksharmala. And in fact, when he came up with it, he proposed, based on empty spots in the table, he proposed hitherto undiscovered elements, and he gave them Sanskrit names. And this story is very well established. So so you have a lot of the stuff, and not only that, 7 years ago, I translated the Vaisheshika Sutras, which is about 600 BCE, and you can uh, get hold of it. It's in a book called Matter and Mind, where you'd see both the Sanskrit and the English translation. And Kanada, in his Vaisheshika Sutras, has at least two of the three Newton's laws of motion, and one in almost exactly the same language. Newton's third law of motion is, to every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Kanada's sutra is Karya Virodhi Karma. Karya is action, Virodhi is, of course, opposition by karma, which is reaction. Karma is reaction. So it's most fascinating that that all of this stuff and much more is generally unknown to not only the Indian layperson or Western layperson, but also to Indian scholars, because after independence, there was a conscious movement under the control of the left. There's a conscious movement to move away from India's own tradition, which has continued to inspire people in the West. I just took names of a few, but many others in the West have continued to be inspired by Indian ideas, because Indian ideas are scientific, and I can say a bit more on it. The Western tradition was based on a kind of a dichotomy that here are individuals and there is nature, and the understanding could not explain the individuals themselves, and that's why the idea of the soul or paradise or whatever happens in paradise was a part of this tradition, even prior to religions of Christianity and Islam. Western paganism, if you will, was not comprehensive like Vedas or Vedanta. In Vedanta, the self itself, or the individual itself, is governed by the same laws as the outside reality. And in fact, this reasoning, which is very systematic and comprehensive, takes us to the idea that there is only one self, and there is a distinction between consciousness and mind, a very subtle notion. And in fact, Schrodinger, in his famous book, What is Life, mentions it repeatedly, that look, Western ideas are wanting, or Western psychology is very limited compared to Indian psychology, because Indian psychology is all scientific. Because the Indian ideas, you look at the Vedas, they believe in rhythm, which means laws, that all manifested world evolves according to laws. There is no dichotomy that here are us individuals, chosen or not chosen, who are sort of outside of these laws. That's not the case here. But it's all understood as one interrelated reality by bringing in the idea that the world of the mind, or the world of the memories, is governed by laws, which is karmas. Okay, somebody, I can't catch what was being said, so I'll stop and wait for finding out what's the question.
Anyone wants to ask a question? Yeah, you can also type it out and I can read it.
Okay, so there was, maybe it was something in the audio. There was no question. I'm sorry, I stopped. So the whole idea of this dichotomy, which of course right now the frontier of science is consciousness, whether you look at it from the perspective of computer science. People are building AI machines. So the question to ask is, will AI machines of the future become conscious, right? So that's the frontier of science, because it's of utmost importance, because if computers became conscious, perhaps they'll get rid of humans, right? Because humans are always complaining. Humans are never happy. So clearly that will happen, and the whole reality, the whole world will change if computers were to become conscious. If you look at it from the perspective of psychology or neuroscience also, The question of consciousness is important, because where is the conscious self inside the brain? You have the neural networks in the brain, but where does consciousness reside? And that is a question to ask. Or in physics, the question is, you have the observer-observed split. So can the science of the observed explain the observer? Now, the standard interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is called the Copenhagen interpretation, is totally consistent with Vedanta. In the Copenhagen interpretation, consciousness is always apart from perceived reality. But after the Second World War, there was an attempt by many quantum theorists to try to explain the observer also through the lens of the observed physics. But in my view, and in the view of a majority of quantum theorists, that's totally failed. And the view of consciousness as being a kind of an independent reality still holds, although, only amongst those who do philosophy of quantum mechanics. A lot of people use quantum mechanics only as a set of algorithms to operate on data. Now, okay, so consciousness is the ultimate frontier of science. And consciousness is what is at the heart of the Vedas. Atma Vidya means science of consciousness. That's what the Vedas are. And how the Vedas see consciousness is as transcendent to physical reality. You have physical reality, and then you have consciousness. And in the Upanishads speak of this split of apara and para. Apara is a manifested reality, which is all subject to laws through rita or ritam, while para is consciousness, the perceiving self. And of course, in this framework, it's also suggested that that the true reality is transcendent, and the manifested reality emerges out of this transcendent reality. That there is a whole cycle from consciousness, from Chaitana or Chit, emerges Akash. From Akash emerges Vayu. These are the elements. From Vayu emerges Tejas. Tejas emerges Apas. From Apas emerges Prithvi. And what they really are, that there are four, these five are to be viewed as, these five elements or bhutas or mahabhutas are to be viewed as different elements of physical reality. Vayu, now of course we are back projecting. Vayu is, in fact, the commentaries on Vaisheshik Sutras or Vedanta commentaries all say that Vayu and Tejas have no matter, have no weight, no mass, which is quite like neutrino and photon. Photons don't have any mass, while Apas, liquidity, which gives, these are not to be viewed as water and earth. These are matter, liquidity, or the liquid phase, the light or energy phase, which is Tejas, and then Vayu is what takes mass away, which is really what neutrino is. So it's most interesting. Now, I must, before I forget, I must also tell you that one of the questions that has been asked again and again is, how does consciousness and physicality interact with each other? Because if consciousness is transcendent, how does it interact with physical reality? Well, this is a question that's been at the forefront of modern scientific thought also. And my late friend, the great Indian physicist from Kerala, George Sudarshan, wrote a paper on it along with his student in the 1970s, where he showed mathematically, and in fact, I have worked on it myself too, that by observation alone, the observer can steer the state of a physical system. Consciousness can control a physical system merely by observation. So you don't have to use any physicality, elements of the physical reality to control physicality just by observation. And this is something which was a part of the discussion or thought within the Indian tradition for centuries. And in fact, in Vedanta, it's called Drishti Srishti Vada, that the deity controls creation through Drishti alone, through observation alone. And prior to that, now this is maybe 3 or 4 centuries prior, but even prior, if you go back to the very beginnings or the earliest tantric texts that we have, or Shvetashvatar Upanishad and other texts, or Kashmir Shaivism, or Sri Vidya. In Sri Vidya is a representation of physical reality and our inner reality, but the light of consciousness in it is shown, which is Shiva, or which is consciousness, is shown as a bindu right in the middle. So the more you look for bindu, you will only see its manifestation, because we are not a part of a light. Our mind is the reflection in the physical embodiment that we are, and therefore we can never be one with it. And that's why that bindu is always beyond us. So extremely extraordinary, beautiful, and all hangs together. All this hangs together. And in my view, this has within it insights which are going to be central in solving the current scientific problems that exist. And in fact, I can give you some information on it, something that I've done myself. One of the if you take this problem of consciousness and look at it from the perspective of cosmology, there is a crisis related to the Hubble constant as computed from based on two different measurements, and that they have not been able to bring them together. One is, if you look at the early universe, which is manifested in the microwave background radiation, or if you look at the rates at which stars are receding from each other, which you can measure by going back into time, into early universe, there are two values which don't square. Now, when I was studying Vaisheshik Sutras and later on, and I've also worked on logic, and in logic, there is a theorem that binary logic is not optimal. If you're looking at integers, ternary logic is optimal. Thinking in threes is optimal. And so in the 1970s, people even tried to build classical computers based on ternary logic. But at some point, it was abandoned because the underlying hardware was too wedded to binary for the investments that were needed for ternary computers to be built. Although ternary computers will be more efficient than binary computers. So ternary logic is superior to binary. And in fact, if you were to allow non-integer numbers, then ternary is not optimal. What is optimal is the number 2.718, which is E. E is optimal. It's an irrational number, like a transcendental number. Now, the thought that came to me 3 years ago was that in nature, everything is optimal. Everything should be optimal. In fact, that's one of the principles that is used in physics itself, called the principle of least action. You can use that principle to explain dynamics, for example. If everything is optimal in nature and E is optimal, then maybe our conception of space being three-dimensional is a gloss through our mind that we place on reality, and reality is actually E-dimensional or 2.718 dimensional. And using this, I've looked at many problems of physics and neuroscience, and you're able to solve, for example, this cosmological puzzle. You can solve, both these numbers come together if you look at it through the E-dimensional lens. Our mind puts as I said, a three-dimensional gloss on a reality of E dimensions. And in fact, it even it even explains gravitation as emerging from E dimensionality. And in fact, in a paper that was just published last month in the journal Theory in Biosciences, I was able to explain using this, the puzzle of the genetic code, where, for those of you who don't know the details of the genetic code, the DNA helix, the DNA gets translated into RNA, and there are 4 bases, or 4 characters. That's like ABCD. There are 4 characters there, and the codons, or the length of the code word is 3. So 4 to the power 3, 64 codons exist, but they code 20 amino acids. Now, 3 of these 64 are punctuation marks, like stop. So there are 61. So if you have 20 amino acids and 61 neurons, logically, you would assign 3 codons to each, right? 20 times 3 is 60, about 3 to each. But in reality, there are some amino acids which are assigned 6 codons, as many as 6. And there are some amino acids which have no redundancy at all, which are assigned only 1 codon. And you can explain this in this paper, which got published last month. And this is a problem which has not been, there's not been a solution to it ever since the genetic code was discovered in the 1960s. So it all gets resolved if you look at it through the E-dimensionality, that this E-dimensionality does not work only for the outer space, but also for the inner space related to our biological information. So there are, and this is just, I'm scratching at surface. There are many problems that exist in sciences. I would urge people to, of course, using all the critical apparatus that you have, be as skeptical as you can, but certainly there's a mathematical theorem, you can't run away from it, that E-dimensionality is optimal. If E-dimensionality is optimal, you should be using this idea, if it's applicable. Maybe it's applicable also to medicine, because Western allopathy, Western medicine is based on binary logic, while Ayurveda is based on ternary logic, and integers, ternary is superior to binary. Maybe the reason why Western medicine did so poorly in the COVID years was because that to look at illness only through the lens of yes or no. If you are ill, you shall use only vaccine. You can't use anything else, which was the diktat from CDC and Western medicine, and just look at the effects. And the fatality rate in the US was about 4,000 per million. In nations where they use whatever they could to deal with symptoms, like Nigeria. Now, you may not trust Nigeria's data, but Nigeria, the fatality rate was only 15. In India, it was probably 400. But in many countries, it is much lower. And not only that, the post-COVID death rate in Europe is much higher than what it was earlier. It's running 20 to 40% higher. So I will not speculate on what the reasons might be. There's a lot of stuff on the internet. There is Robert Kennedy Jr., who has some ideas. There are people like Dr. Robert Malone, one of the inventors of mRNA vaccines, who has some very strong ideas. I'll not talk about those because that's not my field, but these are real reasons. There is a crisis of medicine, there is a crisis of psychology, physics, cosmology, computer science, of all, AI, machines. Will computers become conscious and destroy humanity as we know it? And I think Indian ideas are going to be central in all of this. And Indian ideas, of course, according to Indian ideas, computers will never be conscious. Computers, which is, I think, very comforting And I have articulated this in prior 5, 6 years ago. DARPA in the US through SRI organized a whole series of conferences, and they invited some people, including me, to consider this question of whether computers of the future will be conscious, not just short-term future of 10 years or 100 years, maybe even 1,000 years. And what was interesting was that there was a split, and half the people who know QM, that is quantum mechanics, or who know the larger picture, thought they will never be conscious, and I was one of them. And those who were looking at it only through the lens of algorithms thought that computers will become conscious. Just like you can look at what the brain does is an algorithm, and therefore when computers become sufficiently complex, they should be able to do this too, which in my view is a totally false argument. So computers will not be conscious, and there is something to live for. Do you know, last year in the US, 120,000 Americans, young Americans, mostly young, died of fentanyl overdose, drug addiction, and 50,000 suicides in America. This is a total of 170,000 in just 1 year alone. Now, all the people who died in Vietnam War were only 53,000 during the 10 years of 10, 12, 14 years of Vietnam War. So why is this despair? Because I think the Western idea, you can talk of the idea of India. You can also talk of the idea of the West, or the idea of modern reality as being pushed by the West. The idea of reality as being pushed by the West, not the deepest thinkers, but people who control the establishment, who control the levers of power. They believe in algorithms. They believe that ultimately computers will become conscious, and therefore it's okay to cede authority to computers and algorithms. And I think that is failed. I think intellectually you cannot defend it. And therefore the idea of India is more important than ever before, because this idea of India, which is a universal idea, it's nothing to do with India as a geographical place of people born in certain lineages, because really at its heart, the idea of India is a universal idea that every human being has the same Atman, the same consciousness. Not only that, it embraces even other life. It's an ecological view that other animals also have the same consciousness, accepting that their brain structures are not as rich as ours. That's why a dog probably cannot do mathematics beyond a bird. I think there are some studies which show that birds can count up to 10 or so. At least certain birds can, but they can't do calculus for sure, right? So, but they have the same spirit. They have the same Atman as we have, which is why animals have the same emotions. Certainly anybody who has pets know that animals are no different from us. So this idea of India embraces not just humanity, embraces equally, but also other life. And therefore, I think it has within it the instruments and capacity to help humanity um, uh, uh, deal with the huge crises that confront it at this time.
Yeah, I think my next question, I think you briefly touched upon it. So I'll split it into like two separate questions, actually. One question that you already almost answered is whether consciousness is a result of a biological process only. Uh, Many Western scientists believe that hey, our existence, our mind, everything is a result of just a pure chemical reactions and the neurons that are firing, because as a result of that, and there is nothing beyond that, right? So that's one question, whether that's true. Is it what do the Vedas have to say about this? And the second question is that a lot of people, including Elon Musk and others, talk about we might be in simulation. This may not be real. This world may not be real. And I think the German scientists like Boltzmann, etc., they propose these ideas like Boltzmann brain, where a brain suddenly appears in vacuum purely because of entropy, and that brain has a certain state. So that brain perceives that existence, and we are in some sense a Boltzmann brain, so there is no reality out there. So these are two questions, so you may answer them in any order.
Oh, absolutely. The first question is, where does consciousness come in? Or what is the idea of India as far as consciousness is concerned? Well, consciousness is primary. Consciousness is transcendent. It's not material. So consciousness doesn't emerge because of certain activity in the brain. So very, very clear. So consciousness is not material. And a huge amount of stuff on that. And where it's also significant is that, but of course, our minds are material. The contents of our minds are material. So the question also arises, where does our own personal experience square with our reality as being contents of the mind, our memories and so on, or whatever we take in through our senses, and this consciousness. Consciousness, according to Vedanta, is the light which illuminates the contents of the mind. The contents of the mind are, of course, material. They are based on our senses and so on. But this light, depending upon how clearly we can see this light, it provides to us insights which wouldn't be obvious otherwise. And you can see this perhaps from the life of Srinivas Ramanujan, the great mathematician who died very young at the age of 32 or 33. And even when he was a young boy, and later on when he went to Cambridge and he was a self-taught mathematician, he would come up with these mathematical formulas. And when people would ask him, we don't know the background to it. There's no mathematical, background or history related to these equations. Where do you get it from? And he would say that, well, these formulas come to me through goddess Namagiri. That's a way of saying that through consciousness itself, when you are in a state of heightened awareness, in lucid dreaming, they call it, that's when you get this. In fact, in Vedanta, in Mandukya Upanishad, for example, it's stated that there are three states of consciousness. There is, of course, the Jagrat state, which is awake state. Then there is dreaming state, which is Swapna state. And then there is the deep sleep state, which is the Sushupti state. And corresponding to, in the Jagrat state, in the awake state, we are constrained by our memories and by the framework related to the physical universe, right? So our consciousness is limited by the physical reality. But in the dreaming state, it's not so constrained, because you even imagine that you're flying, for example, or you are in different universes and so on. So there are all those possibilities exist in the dreaming state. In fact, the universal of the dreaming state is called Hiranyagarbha, or the golden womb. So if you are in touch with your dreaming state, which could even be a trance, that's where creative thought comes from. And in fact, if you talk to some of the greatest scientists who have ever lived, and we get it from their autobiographical accounts, like the invention of the sewing machine by Jeffrey Howe in the US, which created the Industrial Revolution. And he got this vision of a spear with a open tip, which gave him the idea that you need a needle with an open tip. A lot of people were trying to invent sewing machine, and that transformed lived life for everybody, because then you could have machines do sewing and stitching and this and that, or Kekule's discovery of the structure of the benzene ring, which was a big problem in the 1850s. So he saw a dream in which he saw 6 snakes in a ring, each holding the tail of the other in its mouth. And he woke up and he says, yeah, you need 6 carbon atoms in a ring, right? Or I can tell you an autobiographical story. In the 1990s, I wrote many scientific papers, as well as a book called The Astronomical Code of the Rig Veda, which you can access very easily. In fact, the book is also in the public domain. And how I came by that is I was reading the New Yorker magazine. I was reading on the last page, there was an essay by John Updike. I think it was October 1992. And in that essay, Updike says, isn't it amazing that looking at the earth, looking at the sun from the earth, looking at the sun and the moon from the earth, their size is about the same. And he started off with that, and then there's something to follow. The moment I read that line, something strange happened within me. I rushed to my library, and which was the other room. It wasn't a huge house. It was the other room from the living room. And I opened my Rig Veda, and I looked at the contents, and I discovered that the whole structure of the Rig Veda is according to astronomical numbers. Nobody had ever thought of it. I had never thought of it, I can tell you honestly. And the whole organization of the Rig Veda, there are 1,017 hymns, which is 339 times 3. And if the sun and the moon are both 108 times their diameter away from the earth. And from sunrise to sunset or moonrise to moonset on a typical day, on an average day, which means equinox day, you will have exactly 339, which is 108 times pi, disks of the sun from sunrise to sunset. So not just these numbers. Are these coincidences? Maybe, but the structure, the fact that the sun and the moon are 108 times from the earth was coded into so many things in Indian thought. 108 beads of the Japamala. You're making a symbolic journey from earth, which is your body, to the inner sun. Or 108 names of the goddess or the gods. You're making a symbolic journey. 108 karanas in Bharatanatyam, which are actually sculpted in various temples in India. I think even in Brihadishwara temple, certainly in 2 or 3 temples. And when Indians went to Java 1,000 years ago, these karanas were also sculpted there. So where does this come from? This comes from outside of you. Consciousness is primary. So if you're listening, because the whole idea in Vedanta, in its Vedanta, Shaivism is also Vedanta, because Shaivism looks at one reality, which is called Param Shiva. Like Brahman in classical Vedanta is called Param Shiva. It's the same thing. The only difference from the perspective of our mind is that Brahman is supposed to be inactive, while Param Shiva is supposed to be active. That here the whole universe is conscious, but in reality, but they're both equivalent. So the whole idea, therefore, is what one is stated, what's one told in Shaivism is Shivoham, Aham Shivaha, I am Shiva, I am consciousness. My true self is consciousness. And therefore you can access, because Shiva has all the knowledge there is. If you were to find your true self, then you will have access to uncommon or extraordinary knowledge. I think all this is very, very attractive. And there is a lot of stuff. You might say, okay, I dismiss Ramanujan's personal stories. He just got these ideas, although they're still working on his textbooks. His textbooks were discovered, his notebooks were discovered in the 1970s, 50 years after he was dead. And mathematicians are still working on that. Or this whole idea, the idea that physical space is e-dimensional and not three-dimensional. It came out of a flash. This was 3 years ago. COVID had broken. I was stuck in Miami, tossing and turning, and suddenly out of nowhere, this idea comes. I was not looking for this idea. So where does this come? I think all of this is stuff which should give us, which should inspire us, because they are scientific. It's not, you're not being told, believe in something strange, a story about somebody coming in with some stuff. It's all for you to test on your own. It's all totally scientific, totally rational, because the idea of India is that all physical embodied reality is according to laws, including us. including us. That's why the law of karma, what does it really mean? So long as you live in the world of mind, all that you do will be governed by your past impressions, and therefore you're really not free. We are not, Rig Veda is a statement, there are two kinds of pashu, bipeds or quadrupeds. Bipeds are us humans. Quadrupeds are, or a cow and horse and so on. But if we discover the Shiva within us, that's when you are free. That's when you are swatantra. That it's to obtain that swatantra state that different methods of sadhana are done. So to sum it all, it's beautiful, it's extraordinary, it all hangs together, it's totally consistent with science, and it has within it the seeds for you, whether you're a scientist or an artist or whatever else might be, or even a businessman, because a businessman also needs original ideas. Businessman is what a businessman does is as wonderful as anybody else, or whatever role you might have in your life. If you discover the Shiva within you, or the goddess working through you, and goddess is the embodied energy within you, in which is a reflection of this light, which is called Shiva. You might not want to call it Shiva, whatever you want to, might want to call it, well, I call it Purushottam. I want to call it, Vishnu, whatever, these are just names, because the Indian tradition even says that Hari and Hara are the same. This is the idea of Hari Hara, Shiva and Vishnu as one, or the goddess and consciousness as one. Goddess is embodied reality, including us, Ardhanarishwara, that we are half Ishvara and half Nari. Nari is our embodied reality. So summarizing, it all hangs together. It's beautiful. It's extraordinary. You can check it out for yourself. It'll transform your life. Not only will it transform your life, you'll also be able to contribute so much more. You'll have more compassion. You'll find empathy. I think this is the salve that the whole world needs. It's universal. It's yoga. This is yoga of life. And the idea of India ultimately is also the idea of yoga. Yoga is, there are 6 darshanas. 5 of them are analytical, right? Purva Mimamsa, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Sankhya, and Vedanta. But the 6th, yoga, is the synthetic one about living life. And yoga is already going to all corners of the world, because this is the only thing that makes sense. Yoga makes sense. You go to any part of the world right now, smallest towns, you'll see yoga studios. And of course, they go to it through the asanas, right? Okay, we want to worship the body, which is also an important thing. The body is the thing which houses our personal consciousness, right? But it ultimately, one step leads to another. It takes you to the mystery of who you are, right? It's all beautiful.
I think with that, we are almost nearing our time limit. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask yourself, or you can post it in chat and I can read it out for you.
Okay, there's a question. Can you elaborate more about the current book, The Idea of Information, and the Idea of India? Well, if you go to Amazon.com or Amazon.in, you'll see a summary of it. And you'll also see, you can download a few pages. You can see many people who have already written about it. So it's very quickly, it's a general overview. It talks about sciences, it talks about yoga, it talks about the Vedas, and I've translated some of the hymns, the shorter hymns of the Vedas as well. And new scholarly information that we have on how Indian ideas went across the Himalayas to different corners. See, for example, before the Slavic world means all of Eastern Europe. Before the Slavic world became Christian, the chief divinity of the Slavs was Svetovid with 4 faces. The idea of multiple faces is a Vedic idea. Multiplicity, from unity comes multiplicity. There are the 5 faces of Shiva, or 4 faces of Shiva, or 3, the Trinity, Trimurti, Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh. So these are all Indian ideas. because they are embedded or expression of the central notion of one consciousness manifested or embodied in different forms. So the Slavs, their chief divinity, Svetovid, which has a beautiful Sanskrit etymology, Shvetovid, the knower of Shveta, here as light, had four faces. The northern face was called Swarog, which is Swarga. The western face was called Perkunis, which is Parjanya, which is one of the names of Indra. The southern face was called Ladaha, which is a Sanskrit word meaning earth, which is beautiful. And the eastern face was called Mokosh, which is Sanskrit term is moksha, right? So these ideas were everywhere. And I think these ideas, just as a couple of 100 years ago, the first wave, the idea of self-knowledge traveled through Vivekananda and other yogi, Paramahansa Yogananda, and so many others. They went to different corners of the world. I think another wave is going out now, going to the very heart of what is reality, which is what is Chit, what is consciousness. In this triad of Sat, Chit, and Ananda. Sat is, of course, reality, existence, which is Vishnu. Chit is consciousness, which is Shiva. And Ananda is the worship of the goddess, which takes us to Ananda. So this whole, everything hangs together. It's not that you are worshiping only Shiva or only Vishnu or only the goddess. They are all the same. There are three different aspects. Triplicate reality. And as I said, mathematical theorem, triplicate is reality. Triplicate in integers, but in reality, it's E. E is, the energy that exists in Akasha. From Akasha emerge our notions of Dik and Kal. Dik is directionality, which is our coordinate system, and Kala is time. A huge stuff exists in it for all of you listeners to explore on your own. Explore frontiers of science and creativity that are not well understood at this time.
I think there's one last question from Rajeshwari Godbole. She wanted to know if there is any information on how the metal tin was brought into Bharat, as I think it is required to make bronze. So, sorry.
Well,
Yeah, I think that.
I think a lot of people, including I think one person in Archaeological Survey of India called Rakesh Mathur. I think he wrote a paper in Nature a few years ago, arguing that this whole dating of Iron Age, etc., is wrong because they're making discoveries where all of this is being pushed further back. Now, I personally am not knowledgeable, so I'm not able to specifically answer this question. But there is a lot of stuff, which I've only seen indirectly. I have not explored it, which sort of changes our views of how this interaction occurred in the past. Now, if you have already seen my book with my co-authors Feuerstein and Frawley in the 90s, called In Search of the Cradle of Civilization, we have a lot of other information there as well. The Rig Veda praises Saraswati as Nadi Tama, the greatest river of its times. But Saraswati dried up at least certainly 1900 BCE, because after that, the settlements on the banks of Saraswati River left that area. So clearly water stopped flowing. But according to archaeologists, it actually stopped flowing about 3000 BC. Why? Because there are no settlements south of Bahawalpur, because it had already stopped going to the sea before 3000 BC. So Rig Veda is much older than what the date that linguists have given, and its own inner evidence. You have evidence related to astronomical events such as, because of precession, the seasons change, and that has been known within the Indian tradition. So these texts are probably as old as the Indian tradition itself accepts, that the Rig Veda is maybe 5,000 years old, not just 3,500. And all of that changes quite a lot of the stuff. And certainly the so-called Indus civilization or Harappan civilization was really a part of the Vedic tradition. And things come together if one does that. So there's going to be a lot of activity in this field scientifically as well. And in fact, there was a paper just recently related to languages. Now, the Proto-Indo-European idea, which I think is totally nonsensical. There was no one Proto-Indo-European language, but linguists who are trying to go back to the earliest place which could have been a homeland of the various IE speaking languages now are looking at south of the Caucasus. Prior to this, and this is a paper which just appeared a couple of months ago, prior to this, people insisted on looking at north of the Caucasus, maybe Ukraine or southern Russia. But now they're already coming to northern Iran, which is just a stone's throw away from India. Northern Iran and Kashmir, we're not very far from each other. So things are changing, and I think there's a lot of linguistic evidence also, which is a part of the book, which you would find interesting. For example, if you look at the names for house in various Indo-European European languages, there are many different names. Now, all of those names are present in Sanskrit. If you take the idea that the Sanskrit-speaking people came from certain region of Europe, let's say from Eastern Europe, then we would only use that term for a house or for other 10 or 20 different main words which are in that language, right? But that's not the case. All the European languages, whether you're looking at Western Europe or Eastern Europe, Northern Europe, Southern Europe, even the name for divinity, Bhaga, in Russian, Slavic languages, it's Boga, right? Or which is Bhaga, which is one name for divinity. In Southern European languages, it's Deva, divinity, the word divinity itself as light. And you have Devata, which is again Dev. Dev means light. So the only way you can make sense of it, not that it matters. I personally don't worry about this whole Aryan invasion. It doesn't really matter. All humanity is one. It doesn't matter. But it's been an instrument that the colonialists have used in India. And certainly it informs Indian politics, all Dravidian politics. It's all about this this imagined invasion of India by outsiders. And I think that's all totally makes no sense. Look at the data. And personally, I say it doesn't really matter. All people are the same. But what ultimately matters is the greatest gift that India has to give is this Atma Vidya, is this science of consciousness, which is universal.
Subhash, I'm trained as a geneticist. I like the way you combine quantum mechanics, which I don't understand, but putting together genetics. That makes beautiful how you put it. Wonderful. I look forward to reading your book. Bahut dhanyawad.
Thank you. And the genetic code, I'm really excited about it because I have a lot of new papers coming in. I don't want to talk about them. They've been accepted. They'll be published. It's absolutely extraordinary. And simple idea from my accidental working on Vaisheshika Sutras, which inspired me to look at what is the meaning of Akasha. It's not space. And the fact that I know mathematical logic, this one step to another. Somebody is holding your hand. It's not from me. The idea comes from outside. And one's got to be awake, to be ready to accept these ideas.
Sure. If you read about a benzene cycle when I was a student, I'm a biologist, trained as a biologist. Now I teach a college of business. And also Ramanujam never explains anything. He got the ideas. Now you're able to take that, connecting it. The reason I asked the question is I want to use this book to teach my younger generations, my children. This book, your book may be scientific and Bhārat together. That's the reason why, and I look forward to, of course, you don't many books, several books, but this is the one I think easiest for second generations.
Thank you.
All the books you read, all the books you wrote. Yeah, this one may be easiest for second generation Indians to understand. Hope to see you sometime in Stillwater. Hope to see you in Stillwater sometime.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that'll be great.
Dhanyavad.
Thanks everyone for attending this talk. I think we are well over time. That shows that people really liked it and asked a lot of questions. And thank you, Dr. Subhash Kak ji, like for giving your time to all of us and talking about your ideas and books. You are a polymath. You have so much to talk about, so different topics and different branches of science. Hopefully, we'll get to talk with you again in future as well.
Thank you. Namaskar.
Thank you.
Namaskar.